Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I've been asked to speak on the establishment and management of recreation centers and recreation parks. But what I'd like to do, frankly speaking, is that I do not have much experience in the managing of recreation centers. So I'll be speaking about the development and establishment of recreation centers. And if you have any questions at all related to the operations or management, please feel free to contact me and I can put you in touch with someone who does management and operations. So just as an introduction to myself, I'm a partner at Proforma Advisors. We're a consultancy that consults on the development of recreation centers and attraction and entertainment projects all around the world. Just as an example of some of the projects I've worked on some of the Legoland theme parks, the Kidzania indoor theme parks, Universal Studios and Fox. And the reason I mention this is not to boast, but because every year we do about 40 different studies and we evaluate numerous projects, but we're very lucky if even one of them makes it past the planning stage or the feasibility stage into planning and development and construction. And so what this suggests, obviously, is that there's a breakdown in the process. And what I would like to present to you today is maybe a framework of thinking about how to develop these projects most effectively so that in the beginning you make all of the right decisions because they impact the results and effects later on. So let's just take a scenario and just imagine with me, if you will, that you are a developer in this city. It's a mid-sized city and you own that plot of land there within the white boundaries. So what do you do? This is a question that a lot of clients come to us with, and in the beginning it's very daunting because there are so many factors you can consider. But I would like to break it down a little bit and propose to you three major questions that I think will help guide your thinking in the beginning. So I think the appropriate strategy whenever you have kind of a piece of land and an idea of what you want to do is threefold. The first is to determine what you can and cannot control. The second is to determine what your priorities are. And the third is to find the right partners who can help you establish this recreation center. And we will talk about all three of these factors in turn, but if we think about the first one, determining what you can and cannot control, returning to that first scenario where you have a piece of land and you're not sure what to do with it, to take a piece of land and turn it into a recreation center and develop it successfully and then to operate it successfully for the long term, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of success factors and things that have to go correctly. And if you even just write down some of them on a piece of paper, it might look something like this, where you have so many factors from marketing to development costs to the training level of your staff to transportation to infrastructure to media, et cetera, and it goes on. And so when you're faced with this kind of, I guess, numerous success factors, it's very daunting in the beginning. But what I would like to propose is that you concentrate on the non-controllable factors first, because there are factors you can control and factors you cannot. The factors you cannot control would include things like the market size, the trends in the market, the competition, as well as things like weather and the climate. And the reason we do this is that if you think about the non-controllable factors, it actually gives you a bit of freedom because it imposes some constraints, and you're not just operating kind of in a vacuum and paralyzed by all of the choices that you have to make. So to talk about some of these non-controlling factors in turn, when you think about a recreation center, there are two major markets and two major target audiences to your recreation center, whatever it is around the world. The first is residents, who are people who live permanently around your recreation center. And the second is overnight tourists who are visiting from other areas who serve as a market to this recreation center. And both markets exhibit very different kinds of patterns in their behavior. So you can have a recreation center that looks something like the left, where you have a large resident market and a small tourist market, or you can have the opposite, which is a large tourist market and a small resident market. And if you have these different types of characteristics, it has very different implications on how you establish your recreation center. So for example, if you have a very large resident market, then you have a very captive audience. They live there permanently 365 days a year. So the implication is that you need to design your recreation center in a way where there's very high repeatability. So if people go to this recreation center one time a year, then there has to be enough there, or you have to renew it in a way so that next year they will want to come again, or next month they will want to come again, because you have a permanent population there. And if you don't have a repeatability in your recreation center, then they will not come again. On the other hand, if you have a very large tourist market, you have a very different dynamic in that this audience has very limited attention and very limited time. So if they're visiting you from a different region, very often they're only going to be there for a few days at a time. And there are hundreds of things that compete for their attention. So you're not competing only against other recreation centers, but you're competing against things like shopping malls or even food and beverage, restaurants. So the repeatability is less important, but marketing is much more important because you need to capture their attention. So this is just an example of, I'd like to emphasize the point that depending on what kind of market you have, the response that you have is also different. And when we talk about markets, I spoke about this yesterday, but a good benchmark to have is that often for recreation centers or theme parks or any kind of attraction, the penetration rate usually is somewhere between 15 and 30% of the market size. So it means that if you have a market size of about 3 million people, then an appropriate attendance range is between 450,000 to 900,000 people. This is important to note because we have a lot of clients who have very inflated attendance expectations, and then it throws off the sizing, and it leads people down the path of believing that what they can build is much different from what is actually possible. So just to return to the scenario I outlined before, let's pretend that we have a plot of land and we hold an internal meeting, a committee session. And we've determined that the market is of a decent size and there's no real competition there. So basically we have a blank slate. So next, we'll move on to the second step, which is determining what your priorities are. So just as in life, when you set a goal and you set your priorities, that kind of determines the pattern of your life and how you lead your life. It's kind of similar in attraction development. In attraction development, you can have roughly 4 or 5 different priorities, and they include the following. So you can prioritize economic impact and job creation. You can emphasize profitability. You can emphasize the fact that you want to build a landmark attraction that is world-renowned. And you can emphasize a short or long period of return. And this is important because determining what priorities you have actually impacts and influences the type of recreation center or the type of resort that you can build. And so, returning back to the example, let's have an internal meeting, and we determine that actually we would like a landmark attraction, one that's internationally recognized, and we determine that profitability is important, but that's less of a concern than the economic impact and the job growth. The last priority that I mentioned is worth delving into a little bit, because this is always where there's a conflict between our clients, the developers, and everyone else, basically. And this is basically length of return. So you can have a development period that is very short, or you can have a development period that's very long. And I think this is worth emphasizing because both of these patterns or structures are equally valid. So the chart here actually exhibits 2 different projects in the same region of the world. One was built in Malaysia and one was built in Singapore. And this was done by the same developer. The one on the top was built over a period of 40 years. So you can see that every few years they invested more and more, and it developed organically over time as they tested the market and they put in more and more expenditures. The one on the bottom was built over a period of only 5 years. They built very quickly, so they required a lot of money up front. And so these are kind of the advantages and disadvantages of these two, in that when you build over the very long term, you don't need as much money in the beginning, and you can test the market over time. But you have the risk that if you don't have enough in the beginning, that maybe people will not come at all. If you have a very short development period, then the risk is that you spend so much money up front and that it doesn't return up to your expectations. And so I just want to give a couple examples, because this is a vitally important question where we always kind of clash with the developers, in that developers are always looking for a very short-term return. They want to see their money back right away. But there are plenty of examples all around the world of very long-term developments. So, for example, Laguna Phuket in Thailand. This is a resort area in Thailand with over 7 hotels, and it was developed over a period of 30 years. It covers over 1,000 acres. It was actually publicly listed on the stock exchange in 1993, so it's very successful. The second one, Bintan in Indonesia. The tourism development zone, it's unique because it's a consortium of governments as well as private sector players. They designed it over 3,000 hectares, and basically for a period of 20 or 30 years, it's been developed over time. As the middle class in in Asia and Southeast Asia has grown. And so there was actually a period of 15 years when they did not do anything. And so over the last few years, it's started to develop again. And so this is just another example. The short term, I gave this example yesterday, but Resorts World Sentosa in Singapore or Shanghai Disneyland, which is opening this year, both of them are $5 billion US developments, and both of them were built over a period of only 4 to 5 years. So while very often people focus on these kinds of short-term mega entertainment projects, there is also a model of a longer-term development, and that's also what I would like to emphasize to you. So let's go back to our internal meeting, pretend that we're having a committee session. And despite all of the things I've said so far, the client internally has decided that we would like an accelerated path to development. So a very quick, short-term return. So, okay, in that case, when you want an accelerated period of return, what you need is a revenue driver. Because you're spending so much money up front, it means that you need a way to raise the value of the land very quickly around you, or you need a way to monetize the land in some way and cash flow very quickly. So these are just some examples of these kinds of revenue drivers. So an attraction could be a revenue driver. Residential development is also a revenue driver because you can often kind of pre-fund your development by pre-selling residences. Casino is a revenue driver in Asia, in other different parts of the world, and also having some kind of landmark hotel or an amenity such as a beach or other kind of natural attraction that's very beautiful is also a kind of anchor that monetizes the land. So going back to our example once again, we've had an internal meeting and we've determined that we're not next to a beach or a beautiful landscape. So we need to kind of artificially manufacture an attraction because we would like a quick path to development. So in that case, what can we do? There are many different types of attractions in the world. These are only 8 examples of the numerous types of attractions that you might be able to consider. But once again, what I'd like to illustrate to you here is that your priorities for the development will determine what kind of attraction you can eventually build. So for example, going back to our examples, we have determined, if you remember, that profitability is less of a concern than generating a splash and building a landmark attraction. That means that we can hold on to these attractions which are inside the circles. So marine animal parks or a theme park or an interactive museum, these types of attractions or recreation centers are typically not very profitable, but they do generate a lot of attention, and they generate lots of jobs. But then again, what we determined, if you remember in the committee session, is that we wanted to create a splash. We wanted to create a large landmark attraction. So in that case, that means we will have to eliminate ones that are smaller. So experiential water parks, or an experiential theme park, or an indoor theme park, or an experiential museum. These might be more profitable, but they are much smaller in scale. And so that's just an example of how the decisions that you make about your priorities actually determine the concept that you can proceed with. So the next one is is choosing appropriate partners. So we've come this far. So basically, you know, what I'd like to emphasize to you is that we've basically come up with a basic concept, we've come up with a basic strategy for the development, just by making very simple decisions. So I showed this slide yesterday, but typically at this point, the next thing you will want to do, since you have come up with a design, you've come up with a concept, is that you'll want to hire a partner with a good designer. And a good designer really is someone that puts an idea and translates emotions into a plan. When you go to a recreation center, or people go to a recreation center because it evokes certain types of emotions, whether it's a sense of escape, or a sense of aspiration or enchantment, or a sense of wanting to connect with people. And a good designer will be able to translate those kinds of emotions onto paper, onto a plan. And the other thing that a designer will help you do is implement the principal rule in attraction development, which is that the longer people stay at your attraction, generally, the more money is generated. Because the longer people are induced to stay, the more likely that they'll have some kind of basic need that will have to be fulfilled. So for example, the longer people stay, they'll get hungry, they'll get thirsty, so they'll spend on food and beverage. If you evoke enough of these emotions for people, they'll feel a sense of connection with your recreation center and want to buy merchandise. And if they stay very long, then they'll need some kind of hotel to stay in. So basically, you know, again, what I want to emphasize is that just by determining, or answering those two questions that I posed in the beginning, which is basically, what are the non-controllable factors and what are your priorities? Just by answering those two questions, we can come up with a concept and a strategy and an operating model. And then at this point, it's appropriate to consult some kind of designer. Very often we have clients who will approach us at the beginning, or approach a designer at the beginning without having thought of any of these issues. If that happens, very often you end up spending a lot of money and spending a lot of time on what could have been answered very simply internally. The other very important partner often in recreation centers or attractions is the government. I presented this series of slides yesterday, but it's worth emphasizing because recreation centers and tourism attractions in general are things that bring people together from all around the region or all around the world. So just by doing that, it creates an enormous economic impact. So for example, there's a one-time construction impact just to build the park. So you spend millions or billions of dollars just in the construction. That creates output, GDP, and it creates jobs. There's a direct impact because it operates every year and it generates revenues that are taxable to the government. And there's a third layer in that it creates indirect employment and indirect revenues. People come from all different regions and they stay not necessarily even in your development but around it and spend on hotels, food and beverage, on retail. And that generates an enormous economic impact in the region. So governments are often the primary partner for large resorts or other types of recreation centers because it is a very logical fit, because a lot of output and employment is generated through these types of developments. So in closing, again, as consultants, we like to emphasize the 80-20 rule, which is basically the phenomenon that you can achieve 80% of the results with 20% of the effort. And often, many people end up spending a lot of time and money unnecessarily. What we want to emphasize here, what I'd like to emphasize here, is that you can ask yourself very simple questions and achieve a lot without spending any money at all. In summary, basically, it's important to ask yourself, what are your constraints in your site? What are your priorities? And who are the appropriate partners after you've answered the first two questions? That's all from me. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hello. Yes, I'm late, so I didn't get the first part. But my question is for the theme parks and the outstanding. In Saudi Arabia, we have very difficult weather that this can go on. Can you tell me if this is something you've been doing in other countries, or it works in other countries?
Yes. Actually, I think I covered this yesterday as well. But when you have a climate like this, you can go one of two different routes. The first is going indoors. So there are many indoor attractions and theme parks around the world where you can have a complete experience inside, say, like the size of a tenant inside a mall. So that would be the route to go. Or you can go for an outdoor attraction that's very nicely landscaped and has gardens or rivers and streams running through it. And there are ways that designers can design in very climate cooling measures through whether they spray water or mist through the air. There's a way to kind of cool it down. And so you can go that outdoor route and you would have to spend a lot more money in that landscaping, but you can do that. The other one is indoor attractions, and that is right now kind of the hot area with virtual reality technologies and augmented reality technologies. Every major theme park brand in the world is pursuing that route.
Sorry. What do you think about what the best ROI for the big resto? It will be the good percentage for this, for ROI. If I have big resto, what the best percentage from the ROI we can good or payback period for my investments?
So the best ROI in terms of the concept?
According to my investment in this location.
So typically for attractions, the best ROI usually comes from indoor attractions. And that's because usually if it's inside a mall, you don't have to buy the land, and you're just renting the land.
It will be continuous revenue, generating revenue, especially here in Saudi Arabia, because according to the weather, it's good in the inside the mall.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Now I want to making a big resto here in Saudi Arabia, in the Riyadh, okay? What do you think the best ROI can give me to return my investments? It's according to 2 years or 3 years.
So what is the best concept or the best?
Best percentage for the ROI. It's the inside the mall, the ROI it's high, but in the big resto it will be lower.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
What do you think about the best ROI in the outside park or the resto?
So the best ROI that you can expect.
Yes.
So typically the largest that we've seen is anywhere between actually 30 to 50%, and those come from indoor theme parks. And there are different types of models for indoor theme parks, but I understand that your group actually has Minopolis, right? So when you look at a model like Minopolis or Kidzania, it's very driven by sponsorship revenues, and sponsorship revenues are actually a very good source of pre-funding. And because of that, indoor theme parks actually tend to have the highest ROI up to those numbers. There are many other brands around the world that have those kinds of double digits. So if you look at Merlin, if you've heard of Merlin, they have Lego Discovery Centers, which are indoor attractions, and they also have things like Madame Tussauds and other types of attractions that are in Dubai currently, and they target going in anywhere between 15 to 25% of an ROI. So, those kinds of ROIs are possible, but usually it's for indoor attractions.
Sir, excuse me, I want to ask about from your point of view, what about the competitive advantage, or what's the best competitive advantage for the theme park that indoors malls? What the competitive advantage should focus from the point of view of the owner?
Sorry, the competitive advantage of a theme park inside a mall? So the primary one is location. So when you're inside a mall, typically you're inside a very urban location and you have high foot traffic. So that would be one thing that you cannot replicate with a very large theme park that's located out in the suburbs. So the location and the access to millions of people who are walking by your theme park every day. That would be the first one. The second one is that because it's indoors, you can do a lot of things that theme parks that are outdoors cannot do, which is that you can completely control the experience. You completely control the climate. You can completely control any types of special effects. So as an example, if you go to Disneyland, or if you've been to any of those types of parks, Disneyland and Universal Studios, they make heavy use of what we call dark rides. And dark rides are when you go inside a structure, and it's kind of like a warehouse, and basically there's special effects, and there's all sorts of cinematic experiences. I mean, those are things you cannot do with an outdoor attraction. So I would say those two are the first two that immediately come to mind. But the first one, location, is definitely the biggest one. So.
Again, Swal, what is the cycle of renewing theme park, indoor theme park? How many years, and what is like to change these games or whatever? I know it's a big investment we put there, and then in 3 years, 4 years times, you have to change it again. Do you have a solution for this?
Sure. So typically, any kind of attraction around the world will have to reinvest anywhere between 8 to 30% of their revenues every year. 8% to 30% of their revenues. So depending, if you are an indoor theme park, you can get away with much less because there's not much hardware that goes into an indoor theme park. But when you're an outdoor theme park, you should be aiming to have at least one new ride or attraction every year. I mentioned this yesterday as well, but there's a theme park in France called Futuroscope, and they have something called a 10-20-60 model. And that is, every year they invest 10% of their revenues to rejuvenate or replace 20% of their attractions so that they can get 60% of their attendance back again the next year. So, in hotels, to use a different subject, you have a CapEx cycle that runs from maybe every 5 to 7 years. You have to kind of renovate the entire hotel inside. But for theme parks, you should have at least something going on every year. So it doesn't have to be the same amount every year. One year you spend maybe 5% of your revenues, and one year you want to build a very big attraction again, so it takes 30% of your revenues. But on average over time, you do need some kind of thing to get people coming again and again. But again, back to one of the points is that that's only true if you have a very large resident market and a small tourist market. So if you have a very large tourist market, as in the case of Orlando in Florida, their Disney parks actually haven't had a new ride in 10 years plus. And it's because 20 million people come to that city every year, and you know, they haven't been there, and it's their first time coming, so they don't have very high expectations, and their resident market is very, very small. So it kind of depends on what kind of, you know, market dynamic you're in. Thank you all for your time.